Ça va avoir le double comme le mien.
D'accord.
Il est un peu...
Ouais.
ouais. Pour commencer, comment est-ce que vous vous définissez idéologiquement comme un populiste, un nationaliste, un national-populiste, un conservateur, un national-conservateur?
How would you define yourself politically? As a nationalist, a conservative, a national populist, a populist?
I think our movement, and I think what I am, is a populist, nationalist, sovereigntist, right, and maybe even traditionalist, about the traditional family and structure. And I think that's the direction of the movement. It's got a little bit of everything: populism and trying to be anti-elite, but also force down in the concept, particularly of the Catholic Church, politically and social teaching, of subsidiarity, to move the decision making down to the lowest level possible. So that's the populist part of it. The nationalist part is the kind of reinforcement of the Westphalian system. Thanks, Dan. The reinforcement. Thanks. The reinforcement of the Westphalian system, right, where people are understand that the nation is the unit with the citizen underneath it, a free citizenry that supports it, and then the sovereignty, that it's the network of the freedom of these nations. Each nation's sovereign into itself, and it can enter into treaties or alliances or into things like the EU or to NATO willingly. So I think when you look at globally what our movement is, all the way from Abe in Japan to even Duterte to what's happening in Australia, India with Modi, even somewhat a little bit of El Sisi, but then up through Europe and then Bolsonaro in Brazil, and what's happening in Colombia and other nations, and the United States, obviously. It's a combination of the populist, nationalist, and I think the sovereignty movement.
Ok, justement, comment est-ce que vous expliquez la montée en puissance simultanée des populismes dans toutes les démocraties occidentales? Quels sont les points communs entre Salvini, Orban, Trump, Bolsonaro, et est-ce que ces mouvements sont vraiment tous comparables?
How would you analyze the growing force of populism among especially the Western and the democracy? And would you say that there are different types of populist movements, difference between them?
Yes, here's the key thing: is that just like in oh, fine, yeah, just bring it in right here, just some ice. It's and I say this, it's like the Chinese say it's socialism with Chinese characteristics that runs China. Here it's populist nationalism with Hungarian characteristics, with French characteristics, with Italian characteristics, Brazilian, America. Every nation, and that's one of the things of nations, each nation has its own particularities, its own issues dealing in the country, its own economic issues, its own social issues, and that's the power of our form of populism, nationalism, and that it's unique to each. It really reinforces back to what's important to that nation. And so what Salvini's dealing with in Italy, right, particularly in the combination with the Five-Star Movement, also what he's dealing with economically, and what he's dealing with their debt problem is different than what's being in France. It's different than what the Swedish Democrats are dealing with in Sweden. It's different than Farage's in the UKIP movement. It's different than what Trump's dealing with in the United States. So that's the great thing about ours. It takes into account those differences where people can still be kind of aligned against this kind of globalist forces in history. And so I think you see a commonality, right? If you talk to Orban, if you talk to Abe, if you talk to Bolsonaro or Trump and the people around them, they have a certain direction that they're heading, but it's all different. It's like a big caravan with many, many different elements making up that caravan, directionally in line with each other, each one with its own peculiarities and specificities. And I think that's the power. I think that's the power of this kind of movement on a worldwide basis.
Et pourquoi et dans quel but est-ce que vous voulez rassembler les populistes européens? La situation, là on a comparé de manière globale, mais en Europe et aux États-Unis, est-ce qu'elle est comparable?
Would you say there's similarities among them? Because we talk about their specificities or differences, but would you say some really common points between European and American populist. C'est bien ça, là.
Ouais, c'est ça. Et
comment-
pourquoi aussi lui il veut les rassembler
Okay,
aujourd'hui?
what makes them common, and why do you want to gather them?
I think what makes them common is that, number one, it's an anti-elitist, anti-concentration of power, whether that power is in Brussels or that power is in Washington, D.C. Remember, the populist movement in the United States is very much about devolving power back to the people, devolving power back to the states, devolving power back down to the lowest level, and standing up against this kind of globalist movement and this permanent political class that's both in Washington and the globalists that are in Wall Street and really Silicon Valley. That this, this kind of globalist party at Davos mentality, right? That is, anti the common man. That's what knits us together with Europe, because here you have almost the same thing. You have the European project of Jean Monnet, and the internal logic of that project was to turn Europe into a United States of Europe, right? Where Italy is South Carolina to France is North Carolina, Spain's Georgia to Hungary's Maryland, right? You were just administrative units, not kind of free independent nations. And so that kind of going against the centralized authority of Brussels and the European Central Bank is the kind of the similarity. The similarities are, number one, the Treaty of Westphalia. The nation state is the unit that we should govern ourselves under, right? And that the globalists look at, and I take Marine Le Pen's great saying, the globalists are someone who looks at the nation state as something to be overcome. We look at the nation state as something, a jewel to be polished and to be nurtured. So number one, it's about the nation state. Number two, it's about the citizen. It's on their shoulders is where the nation state is really, controlled at. And decision making should be pushed down as close as possible to citizens' participation. And so I think that's two commonalities. The other is that, we're about sovereignty. We're about individual national sovereignty of the people in that nation. And they can have alliances. They can be in transnational, multinational units. But the nation state is sovereign and makes its own decisions. And the last part, and I think this is a part you saw in the World Congress of Families yesterday, I think there is a budding, although our moment has libertarians in it and others, I do think you see what is coming, and you see this from Trump, you a little bit see it from Marion Marshall here in France, you see it from Salvini, you definitely see it from Bolsonaro, you see it from the Japanese, a return to traditional social structures, a return to the traditional family, a return to the traditional customs of the country. And so I think that is both I think that's the commonality, and like I said, the differences. I think the differences are what's peculiar to that country, both culturally and also economically.
On va reparler tout à l'heure après des européennes,
Okay.
etc. Mais
We'll speak later on the European election.
mais
but yes, few points.
peut-être parlons un peu de vous, votre parcours. Comment on passe de producteur de Friends à conseiller du président Trump?
The producteur de Friends?
Ouais.
He wants to talk more a little bit about you. How did you become from a producer of Friends to the
From a what of Friends?
producer of Friends?
Oh, for Friends, yes.
For
Friends.
J'ai eu peur.
No, it's Seinfeld.
Oh,
Ah,
c'est
Seinfeld.
voilà.
Seinfeld.
Producer
Sorry.
of
Yes.
Seinfeld
Yes.
to the main advisor of president.
Listen, it's not the Seinfeld thing's a sideshow. I come from a very humble working class family in America. My grandfather was a lineman for the phone company for 50 years. My father's essentially a blue collar worker for the phone company for 50 years. They're the only father and son, I think, in the phone company that both worked 50 years for the phone company. We come from a traditional Catholic family, 5 children. My mom was a housekeeper, was a mom, and so it comes from a very traditional family structure, a very traditional. We were Democrats. We were part of the working party of the Democrats, and so it's. That if you look at a lot of what I do and a lot of what I talk about, it's just trying to empower those working class people. Now, it turns out not many of those people are with the Democratic Party anymore. The Democratic Party has turned to become a cultural Marxist party, very progressive, very anti-traditional family, very anti-working men. They become a party of globalists, right? And so the working classes in the United States really started voting Republican, but really wasn't represented by the Republicans. The Republicans supported free trade, no protection of industries, open borders, unlimited migration, illegal immigration, and so that's why Trump. This project I've been working on for 10 years. Trump. I got called into the Trump campaign relatively late because they were in such bad shape. He was losing so badly, and was able to help turn it around. But the reason they reached out to me is I've been doing this for 10 years, and that's why I'm doing it today. So regardless of being a naval officer, regardless of going to Harvard Business School and Georgetown School of Foreign Service, regardless of working on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs, my roots are very populist and very blue collar, and now I've dedicated my life to make sure that those people have a voice.
Ok. But, à Hollywood, malgré tout, c'est pour m'amuser un petit peu, c'est un détail, mais ça devrait être quand même le choc des cultures, quoi, et des classes. Est-ce qu'ils le détestaient là-bas? Est-ce qu'ils le détestent?
Working in Hollywood must have been a class conflict or class shock for you to confront to that type of people. Did they like or dislike you because of that?
Remember, I went to Georgetown, Harvard, and Wall Street first. So it wasn't like I arrived and it was. No, it's that in Hollywood, I helped and worked on people that are conservative, so try to get financing and try to get films made. But mainly my business was purely financial, restructurings, M&A, financings, bankruptcies, etc. Highly technical. That it didn't matter what the political affiliation. Hollywood is Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And I was able to. That part of it doesn't interest me, so I had no involvement in that. I clearly ran a investment, and honestly, half of my time was overseas. I spent a lot of time here in France. We worked on a lot of. We talked at Canal Plus about a lot of deals. We worked on. I think it was Bouygues, looked at something years ago that we took a look at. Societe Generale eventually bought my firm. So SocGen, I actually came to La Défense and did a lot of work at La Défense, and then they bought Hambros Bank in England, and I spent most of my time running the media group worldwide out of England for SocGen, because SocGen bought my firm. So it was look, I kind of knew what I was getting into in Hollywood, and so, but I could, I was never attracted to the social part of it. So the rest of it was just work.
Okay.
It's like Alexandre coming to Paris because he come from the suburbs. One of the few guys coming outside, and he has the energy, and he must be in conflict sometimes with Paris.
Yes.
Est-ce que l'expérience de l'armée a été aussi quelque chose de déterminant?
Your experience in the army, was it a very impact on you? Very important lesson?
Yeah, so I was a naval officer, and I was a naval officer in the Pacific Fleet that I always wanted to go to. I had great attraction for Asia. So I went to the Pacific Fleet on a destroyer as an officer that hunted Soviet submarines. Our mission was that we were in anti-submarine warfare, ASW, so South China Sea, East China Sea, Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean. I did 2 tours at sea. The second one during the hostage crisis, where we actually went up into the Persian Gulf. It was a formative experience, right? It reinforced my patriotism and love of country to kind of, go throughout the world and be in the defense of America at its, at the far reaches of where America is and its allies. And it was a great experience to see how big and how massive the world was, right? I was in China in '77, in seeing India, seeing Pakistan, things like that, things that would never have come into my experience as a young kid from a relatively small state in a relatively small city in Richmond. That was quite quite inward looking. So it was a great thing to me. And then later, my daughter, my oldest daughter, went to West Point, and she served with the 101st Airborne in Iraq. One of the great pictures I have at the Breitbart Embassy on the mantle is where she is. She's in her combat fatigues with her weapon, sitting on the throne of Saddam Hussein, And so it's a great and it was a great experience for her to go to Iraq, and then eventually she came to Europe and Eastern Europe, serving in the army. So yeah, the military is a great formative experience, and really reinforced the love of country and the duty of every American to kind of serve the country.
Okay. And l'expérience dans le monde de la finance, il en a parlé de Goldman Sachs, a-t-elle aussi été un tournant d'une autre manière, évidemment, mais dans sa prise de conscience?
Your work in Goldman Sachs, was it also a turning point in your life in another way?
Yeah, the thing with Goldman Sachs was I was in the mergers and acquisitions department back in the mid 80s, when that was the center of what investment banking was, with all the hostile takeovers. It was a formative experience. One of the formative experiences was that in all this kind of hostile takeover, and where chairmen and CEOs have to make big decisions under pressure, it was number one to see how people make big, tough decisions under pressure, where you don't have perfect information, and the decisions you make will literally make the success or failure of the company will hang in it. That was the type of thing that helped me on Billy Bush weekend, when the president was under intense pressure to make all these decisions. In fact, the Republican establishment wanted him to drop out. They wanted him to quit. I was the one person that stood up and told him, just keep doing what you're doing. Don't worry about Billy Bush. We're just going to power through this. And that came from a lot of experience at Goldman Sachs, that under intense pressure you don't have perfect information, but you got to set your path, and you just got to stick to it, right? You cannot waver. If you waver, you're going to be defeated. The other thing was that I realized, saying this, my grandfather who was always one of my heroes, and my grandfather only went to third grade in school. And my dad just went to high school. He didn't go any above that. But they were two of the smartest guys I ever met. And I realized in working at Goldman Sachs and at SocGen later, and seeing all these brilliant guys run these companies, they're not that much smarter than working class people. That the collective wisdom of working class people is just as smart as the elites. And so I got a real eye opener about people and decision making. And so that's one of the reasons I say that if you had to govern by the first 100 people that came to a national rally meeting, right, to see Le Pen or National Front, or the first 100 people that came in red ball caps to see Trump, versus the top 100 partners at Goldman Sachs, I would pick the deplorables every time to govern the nation over the top 100 partners at Goldman Sachs.
Okay, et je crois que son père a perdu ses économies dans la crise de 2008. Est-ce que ça l'a motivé à se battre?
Lui ou son père? Lui.
Lui.
Ouais. So your dad seems to have lost his money during the crisis of 2009, 2008. Did it push you even more to fight?
Yeah, but the reason is that he's a very humble guy, and it wasn't a lot of money, but he had it all in the. He put all of his money in AT&T, the company he worked with for 50 years, and AT&T was the equivalent of the Catholic Church, right? He would have sold stock in the Catholic Church before he sold stock in AT&T. That's how central an institution it was. And what happened in 2008, through no fault of his own and no information was given to him, the whole thing collapsed. And he was told by the guys on TV, etc., you got to sell your stock, and the stock's about to go off a cliff. And so he sold. And you look back, all the bailouts were done. All the wealthy got bailouts, all the elites got bailouts, all the top companies got bailouts. Goldman Sachs, GE, AIG, all the investment banks got bailed out, all the commercial banks got bailed out. Well, the little guy got no bailout. They just basically got destroyed. And that's when it started to seem to me that a guy who had played by the rules, people like my father are basically the backbone of society. They're the little guy, right? But they're the little guy that goes to work every day, does a great job, cares for a family. He raised 5 kids and sent them all to Catholic schools, pays his taxes, he basically is the contributor that makes civic society go. And when you screw those people over and don't have any, that's when you're going to lose the entire kind of social structure. And today, you look around in France and you look around in the United States, we haven't recovered from the financial crisis of 2008. You look at Italy. We have not recovered, right? The elites took care of themselves, but the backbone of society, and look at the Gilets Jaunes is a perfect example. Look at the deterioration of their lives over the last 8 years, of where they used to work in great manufacturing jobs and had high value added, they had high value added manufacturing and good solid incomes. They could raise families. Now they're barely making it, right? And there's clearly anger out there. That's my whole point, is when you take the backbone of the country, the working class people that make up civic society, that when you start literally not caring about their welfare whatsoever, and it's kind of devil catch the hindmost in these financial crises, you're going to start losing society, and that's what leads to revolution.
Ok. Et justement, la crise de 2008, est-ce que selon lui, c'était seulement une crise économique et financière, ou est-ce que ça a été aussi le révélateur d'une crise morale plus profonde?
Would you say that the crisis of 2008-2009 was just an economic crisis, or it was much deeper, like a moral crisis?
It's a financial crisis that led to an economic crisis that's now led to a political crisis. So you have to see it in that context. The financial crisis was certainly, the crisis itself was currently pointed to a rot in the moral structure and the moral fiber of the elites. But the solutions actually point to even worse of the rot of the moral fiber. Remember, it was the best law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, banks, and investment banks, the elite of the elite in the city of London, Frankfurt, and particularly Wall Street, that did the due diligence in all these derivative deals, that structured the deals. I mean, these are the people from Yale and Harvard and Stanford, at wherever you want to go, the law firms, the accounting firms, all of it. That was the elite of our country, the meritocracy that unwittingly, got us into this financial crisis, and then with the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, it all imploded. Okay, but then it was the solutions. The immediate solution was to go bail themselves out, to basically open up the taps of liquidity, what we call quantitative easing, to basically, stop the fear of deflation, flood the zone with over $4 trillion of liquidity, and to bail themselves out at the huge detriment of the little guy, right? And that's why today you have savings accounts that don't return any interest at all because of zero, negative interest rates that they use to bail them out. You see the huge gaps in the pension fund liabilities. You can't do bond offerings for localities or schools because there's no juice in the bond offering. So they basically, on the backs of the little guy, bailed themselves out. So I think it shows you a rot in moral society that got us to the financial crisis, and then the refusal to accept accountability and responsibility by the elites, and to slough it off. And your current revolt in France today is very much this terrible deal of this Paris Accord, where you essentially allow China, the biggest polluter in the world, to continue to pollute and to pollute and to pollute, and build capacity in steel and aluminum, and these other things are just huge pollutions, and then to have that paid for by the Gilets Jaunes, to cut taxes on the wealthier, but then to have the Gilets Jaunes essentially pay for it. That's why there's anger, because this is a perfect example of the moral rot of the party of Davos and the elites. One more point about their moral rot. In the third week of January of 2017, there were two speeches given. One in Davos by President Xi, and a couple of days later in Washington, the inaugural address of President Trump. President Xi goes, and he's the savior for globalization. Remember, we're just 8 weeks from the biggest defeat in American history, where this populist movement, this nationalist movement, has now defeated Hillary Clinton, the ultimate globalist. So the world's media and the party of Davos is actually in shock. They don't know where to tune. They don't know what's going to happen. They just know this wild man Trump's coming to Washington to tear down the whole structure. And so Xi comes to Davos, and they praise him. You look at the Economist and the Financial. He gives a speech reinforcing globalization, reinforces the force for good, saying that the world's problems are because these populists and nationalists. But Xi is there to re-emphasize the centrality of China in this globalist system. It's going to work. Now, they're all there, all the consultants, all the bankers, all the lawyers, all the Davos guys. Davos man is sitting there clapping. She's our savior. She's great. Those people at the time knew about the Uyghurs, right? About 1 million Muslims that are basically in concentration camps and re-education centers by the Chinese. They knew about the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan Buddhists that are being suppressed by the Chinese. They knew about the evangelical Christians and the Catholic Church, underground church, that are being suppressed. They knew about the Chinese people that are being basically turned into slaves by this radical cadre of the CCP. Yet they hailed, with all that knowledge, they hailed Xi as a savior and pointed to Trump as the devil. And all Trump's speech was a reinforcement of the Westphalian system, that the nation state is the basic unit, and that we will drive for us Americans looking after the United States of America as we want our allies and partners to look after their countries, right? To make France great again, and Italy great again, and Poland great again. But they held Xi, and they said Trump's the bad guy. That shows you the moral rot at the center of the party of Davos. That they would hail a totalitarian dictator knowing everything he's done. And here's why. In Davos, it's about one thing. It's about money. They have absolutely no moral authority. It's all about money. And anybody that comes and pays their consulting fees and pays their investment banking fees or shows them better stock picks, they will worship. Okay? It's Davos is about the golden calf. And that's why they have no moral authority in the world. And quite frankly, that's why we can defeat them. Because they don't really stand for anything except for money. And I think that those two speeches that week show you everything you need to know about the moral rot at the heart of the globalist project.
On va revenir à la Chine plus précisément après, mais juste un mot sur l'establishment du parti républicain. Est-ce qu'ils s'en sont proches? Je ne crois pas. Et est-ce qu'ils ont une part de responsabilité justement dans la paupérisation des classes moyennes qu'il a décrit?
How close do you feel from the Republican establishment? And would you say they're responsible of all the economic situation of the blue collars in the U.S.?
100%. The Republican establishment is fought Trump every step of the way. The Republican establishment is not with us in this populist movement on trade. They're one of the biggest proponents for Trump to do a quick deal that's based around just soybeans and whatever for the value of the stock market. They're not for forcing China to do major structural reforms, and they're also for unlimited mass illegal immigration to have more low-skilled labor to push wages down and increase margins, and they're all for more legal immigration to have competition on labor among tech workers. The Republican establishment, when Li He in the Chinese delegation comes to Washington for their negotiating sessions, one of the first things they do is go to Capitol Hill and have lunch with the Republican establishment. The Republican establishment and donors are totally misaligned with the worker kind of party base of the Republican Party. That's why Trump caught him by total surprise. Remember, you go back to the primary of 2016, you had 12 to 14 candidates who were the top candidates in their verticals, right? And put up, by decades of work by the Heritage Foundation, Cato, AEI, the Koch brothers, Paul Singer, all of it. You had, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Chris Christie, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul. Whether you had libertarian and Rand Paul, or a limited government conservative and Ted Cruz, or a big government governor like Chris Christie, or a neocon like Rubio, or the Bush faction like Bush, or Ben Carson, you go down each vertical. That was the creme de la creme, the flower of a generation of the Republican establishment in their thinking. And Donald Trump came up and said, "Hey, we're gonna build a wall, shut the borders, no mass, and I'm gonna bring jobs back from China by putting tariffs on them because I'm a protectionist." They had never heard this, but no, it wasn't in the vernacular. They didn't know. If you go back and look at the primary, they didn't know how to respond because, as political bots, as robots, they had been programmed to think, "What? I can't." And they were so. You think the Democrats were stunned when we won Michigan and Wisconsin? The Republican establishment told me to my face the weekend before the voting day, on that Sunday, not to come to Wisconsin. That we were going to lose by 3 to 5 points. They wouldn't be associated with it. This is Paul Ryan. We will not be on a stage with you. You can't come. And I said, what are you talking about? We're right over the target. We can win Wisconsin. It's going to be close, but we can win. We have to come. And they refused to be on a stage with us. And we diverted to go to Minnesota. We didn't go that Sunday because they refused. They had no grasp that we could win Wisconsin on Trump's working class, mandate and vernacular. And that's why, no, the Republican establishment has been Trump's, I think has been outside progressive. The opposition party media is number one. The progressive cultural Marxist of the Democratic Party has been number two. And the Republican establishment's number three. And that's all combined into kind of this permanent political class that's in bed with the media and the donor base that has fought Trump from the beginning.
Ok.
Boy, now you're getting me worked up.
Ouais. Vous n'aimez pas trop l'école de Chicago. You don't.
So you're not fan of the Chicago Boys or Chicago School
The
of
who?
Economic? The Chicago Boys, Chicago School of Economic with
Chica boys?
yeah, Chicago Boys. Like what we study in economics here, basically the
Austrian School of Economics?
yeah would be what you call Austrian-
University of Chicago.
Yeah,
yeah.
Chicago. Chicago.
Yeah.
No, no. I'm not I don't believe in the neoliberal economic model. I don't believe in Austrian School of Economics. I think I'm a capitalist, but I believe in real capitalism. I think capitalism it's hard, it's practical. These guys are so theoretical. Remember, it's this Chicago school and the Austrian School of Economics that have turned free trade into a fetish. Okay? And we've had a system that we're up against the world has two systems right now. It has a totalitarian mercantilist system in China, right? That's trying to consolidate power with One Belt, One Road, Made in China 2025 and 5G rollout. So they're trying to control, and they were just here last week offering France $60 billion on 30 different deals, right? They're going to be your new partner, okay? They're going to turn France into a colony, okay? That's their geoeconomic strategy. Versus the Western democracies, which still work under this model of kind of, the neoliberal order, but the problem is we're up against the manufacturing base that's a totalitarian mercantilist system that completely waives the rules of the WTO in most favored nations on trade. And so we begin to crush all the jobs, the Gilets jaunes jobs. Hey, they all went to Asia, all the manufacturing jobs, right? And that's where the anger is. And so, no, all that stuff is nice theoretically. In the real world of practical power economics, we've gotten crushed. Because we've listened and we've had the guys in the Austrian school chirping on the sideline and writing in the editorial pages, of like here, you have to have, if you're not a free trader, you're essentially, they accuse me of being basically a communist, Bolshevik, right? Because I'm for protection of industries and protection of workers.
Ok. Et, est-ce que finalement votre plus grand défi, c'est pas de convertir le parti républicain au protectionnisme?
Isn't your biggest challenge to convert the Republican establishment or Republican Party into a more protectionist position?
I think it's the biggest. I think here's where we're making huge progress. The bellwether in this is China. When we first started, when Trump won, one of the things I put it into all the speeches to talk about China and bringing jobs back is one of the reasons we won, particularly in Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, the upper Midwest. Because the corollary of the jobs missing, as J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegies, tells us. He's the great sociologist. He says he cites the reports from MIT and Harvard that say there's a direct correlation between the factories that went to China, the jobs that went with them, and the opioid crisis, which is now, killing 50,000 people a year. It's a crisis beyond comprehension in the United States, the fentanyl opioid. The shift that we've seen, because the Republican establishment will still fight you theoretically, but now that we've engaged, we have all sources of government engagement with this economic war China's been running against us, okay? That you're seeing, you're seeing that even these guys understand there has to be major structural changes in the Chinese economy. There's 6 areas, verticals that you need to change. The 2 most important is forced technology transfers and the subsidies given to state-owned industries. There's also other about intellectual property theft, non-trade barriers, currency manipulation. And this affects people in France as much as it affects people in the United States. This is why when Trump is doing this, he's doing it for all the industrial democracies, Japan, North America, and Western Europe, is that we've been played by China. And the two worst of all the 6 areas of currency manipulation, everything else, is forced technology transfers. In other words, when a company in France does business or wants to put manufacturing in China, right, or some sort of business in China, you have to do a joint venture where they get access to your technology and then they just rip it off. So it's not just intellectual property theft where every day they're doing cyber theft nonstop. It's you are forced to give them your technology. In the West, the beating heart of Western capitalism, modern capitalism, is innovation. It's what drives our economy is innovation. They're literally forcing us to give that innovation to them with no compensation. That's number one. And then they can take that and then build manufacturing around it. The second, and this is where it's also been felt in France, is they continue to put massive state subsidies into state-owned industries that run at massive capacity. The number one Chinese export in the world is deflation because of their overcapacity. And that's why you don't get any pricing pressure within Japan, the United States, France, to be able to get prices up. You can't. Steel's a perfect example. They have 800 million tons of steel capacity, and they're adding steel capacity, where, I think the rest of the world is like million tons, it's 800 million tons to 700 million tons. And the pricing pressure, you can't get any price increases because of the Chinese price pressure. That's across the board in virtually every industry in which they get involved. And so what Trump is now got, even the Republicans, a lot of them are saying, I understand now the situation over 20 or 25 years we got into China. Yes, we must fight, and we must fight hard for these major structural changes, because if we don't get that, if we don't get major structural changes in this trade deal, and Trump, you should understand, the trade deal he's cutting with thing has as much impact for the people in France as it has almost for the people in the United States. If he does not get these structural changes, and they complete One Belt, One Road, and they complete Made in China 2025, which is to take all advanced manufacturing, and they complete the Huawei, a 5G rollout, they will dominate the future of high technology, and they will dominate the future of advanced manufacturing. And essentially, France and the United States and the rest, we will become tributary states. We will be like Jamestown to their Great Britain. We will provide them raw materials, we'll provide them some component parts, and we will be a market for their finished goods. But we will essentially be a virtual colony of the Chinese.
Ok. La Chine est un ennemi commercial, économique, vous l'avez dit, il y a une vraie guerre commerciale que Trump a déclenchée contre la Chine. Est-ce que ça peut être aussi une menace militaire à terme?
China is obviously an economic enemy, financial enemy. Could it be also a military enemy?
So the Chinese, there's a book I didn't bring it with me, called Unrestricted Warfare. Unrestricted Warfare. It was written in the late 1990s by 2 Chinese colonels in the PLA. It lays out a kind of a war plan against the West. And it lays out 3 types of war: information/cyber, economic, and kinetic, or guns up. Okay? It basically says, the one thing the West can do is fight. And they really know how to fight. Their advanced armaments, military strategies, technologies. We never want to take on the West militarily. But we can defeat them by using information warfare/cyber and economic. And so for the last 20, 25 years, they've been engaged in direct economic, essentially warfare with the West, to destroy the West economically and to make it part of their system. Also, in the last 5 or 10 years, they've ramped up information warfare, both information warfare from a propaganda and narrative perspective, okay, and also the cyber theft of intellectual property, but also potentially offensive cyber capabilities. I hope that we don't get to military conflict. Now, as a young man in the mid-1970s, I was on a destroyer in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is the major waterway in the world. I think 40% of world trade goes through there, okay? And China, over the last couple of years, has essentially claimed the South China Sea, which has always been open to free navigation of every nation in the world, patrolled by the Americans since World War II. They built, I think, 7 stationary islands that are essentially aircraft carriers. They've claimed the South China Sea as a territorial sea of China, and they want safe passages of navigation. I said on my radio show in 2014, I think, or 15, that within 5 years I thought we'd be in a shooting war in the South China Sea. I just got back from 8 days in Japan. If you're in the Western Pacific, if you're around East Asia, they think that potential military conflict is much farther along than we in the West, and they don't put Korea as number 1 on that. They put Korea as number 3. They think that the 2 biggest hotspots are Taiwan and the Straits of Taiwan and the South China Sea. I think people in the West, unless we really come to grips and confront China on the economic warfare and start to get them to come into our system and put pressure on this radical cadre of the CCP, it could devolve to actual conflict in the South China Sea. Now, I hope that's avoided, and it can be avoided, but it's only going to be avoided if we confront, and that's what Trump's done. The hallmark of Trump's presidency and what he will be remembered for is this, he is now engaged in this confrontation with China. In the last 2 years, it's completely redone the American government's focus on this. And now we have all forces of government on that. And it will become a defining issue of his presidency, and it's going to become a defining issue of the 2020 presidential campaign.
Ok. On a combien de temps encore?
Do you know how much time left we have? How much time?
Yeah, you've got another 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes.
15 minutes.
15 minutes. Ah ouais, d'accord. Il y a encore pas mal de questions. Donc on va
Just keep asking. You just keep going. At your pace.
Est-ce que la plus grande menace, c'est pas aussi l'islamisme pour l'Occident?
Don't you think the biggest threat for the West is Islamism?
I think that radical Islam, and particularly politicization of some of the tenets of Islam on Sharia law, are clearly a significant threat to the West. But I think that we can come to grips with that, and not just that. I think we have a partner in the Middle East that understands it's a problem. General al-Sisi's speech, I think it was January 1st of 2014, right, at Cairo University, or December 28th of 2013, or it was just around 14. Well, in that speech where he laid out that Islam had to reform itself internally, it had to go through modernity, and only the nations in the Ummah in Islam could do that. I think that is why under President Trump, remember, it was quite symbolic what we did. We went Riyadh, Jerusalem, and Rome on our first trip to kind of lay out, the great centers of Islam, Judaism, and the Judeo-Christian West. So I think in working together with Gulf Emirates like UAE, right, like Saudi, like others, we can start to really can't clamp down on the financing of radical Islamic terrorism. It's for the individual nations, though, I think here to maybe even get more aggressive. And I think it's imperative to them. It's clearly a threat. It's clearly a threat to the Judeo-Christian West. But this is not Islam overall. It's this radical interpretation that is Islamic supremacist, particularly around Sharia law and what I call radical Islamic jihad. I think the nation is I think Trump's been a great leader in that. I think we've totally turned it around in the United States, and we got to continue to embark on that. But if you look at existential threats, it's the Chinese economic engine. The reason is China is so economically so overpowering to the West, right? Given its size, given its history, and given its ambitions. You look at One Belt, One Road, right? I mean, look what happened in France last week, where Xi came and he brought $60 billion with him. Right? And if it gets done, France will be quite different than it is today. As a bigger problem as radical Islamic jihad, and it's a big problem here. One of the reasons is that the globalists have looked the other way as this problem is being able to metastasize. But to me, that can be handled by just focus and determination. The Chinese threat is of such a scale, right, that you see even it's tough for Macron to look the other way when you come bearing $60 billion of cash.
Toi, tu pensais peut-être sous l'angle démographique, tu veux que j'en remette une couche là-dessus ou pas?
Je sais pas parce que sinon
Ok.
on va
Vas-y.
pas réussir à finir. Je vais en poser en rafale du coup pour que plus que la gauche je passe un peu du coq à l'âne mais tant pis, plus que la gauche à la Bernie Sanders, ce que vous détestez, est-ce que c'est pas ce qu'on appelle aux États-Unis la gauche en limousine, quoi, la gauche qui vient en France, la classe des libéraux et des experts, et qu'est-ce qu'ils pensent de la politique des identités menée par la gauche en direction des minorités, du mouvement MeToo. Est-ce que tout ça, ça fracture pas l'Amérique? Est-ce que c'est pas aussi un combat contre le politiquement correct dans lequel il est engagé? Je suis désolé, je t'ai fait beaucoup de trucs.
Ouais, je vais essayer de regrouper.
Comme ça, on avance.
Even your big battles against politically correctness, against the left limousine, against the identity politics that the left is going through, and I don't know what was the third one.
Est-ce que cette politique des identités fracture l'Amérique? Est-ce qu'il n'est pas dans un combat contre le politiquement
And doesn't this identity politics is dividing the U.S., breaking the nation?
Listen, the progressive left always, and they talk about Trump being divisive, they always want to go to identity politics right away, right? Because they think it's a way they reinforce their values and they think it's a way for them to win. I don't mind when they go to identity politics. That's why I said here to Front National, when you look at the facts of what Trump has done with his policies to have the lowest black unemployment in history, the lowest Hispanic unemployment in 40 or 50 years, and wages rising in those two categories, and you can already see in the polling that Hispanic Americans are starting to turn to Trump. I think Trump's over 40% approval by Hispanics, and so it's cutting out the legs of the Democrats. That, as I said here to the Front National convention, if they're talking about identity politics, right, and they come back to you and they accuse you of xenophobe, nationalism, nativism, racism, that accusation shows you're winning because they don't have anything to back it up. They will never engage. They don't want to engage in the economic arguments of economic nationalism and how you support the working people. They want to make this about. They want to just smear you with racism. So I think that's a loser strategy. The more the Democrats do that, the tougher they have to beat Trump and to really win. So for me, I'd love it when they do that because to me, they're not spending time on really talking and connecting with working class people.
Ok. Je vais sauter quelques questions. Après, on verra après quel regard il porte sur la France aujourd'hui et qu'est-ce que lui inspire le mouvement des Gilets jaunes. Nous, on parle beaucoup de France périphérique. Est-ce qu'il y a une Amérique périphérique aussi, donc ce parallèle France des Gilets jaunes et Amérique de la working class, quoi.
Ouais. How do you see the situation in France? How do you look the Gilets jaunes movement, and would you make a comparison between the Gilets jaunes movement and the situation that is sociologically what we call the periphery, the suburbs of the big town, with the blue collar in the U.S. or the Midwest or this America that is not taken into account by? I
think the logic in back of the initial revolt of the Gilets jaunes was quite comparable to a lot of what the deplorables did. I just wish that the Gilets jaunes had not gotten violent. I don't think violence, even though you may be angry and you may feel that, hey, this is the only way I can get people's attention, I don't think that increased violence helps push your narrative of the changes you want to actually see happen economically and socially. And so I think there was a lot of commonality. That's why I think that if you look at the European parliamentary elections, Macron, at one time during the height of the Gilets jaunes revolt, he was in the mid-teens or high teens. He's not back yet in his polling to where he was in the first round of voting in the general election. So the Gilets jaunes, I think by bringing this up, and now I think the National Rally and others by reinforcing how weak his policies have been for working class Frenchmen, you've kind of put a cap on Macron. He's back down. And so I think in that regard, it's been, like I said, I think the grievances and what particularly the diesel tax on automotives was so offensive, right? Eventually they put it on hold and then they rescinded it. That it's very common, I think, to some of the things that happened with the deplorables. One of the things with deplorables, we channeled all that energy, all that anger, into supporting Trump and kind of this Trump movement to keep electing Trump next time, and didn't take to the streets and have the violence. And I think the violence only hurts what you want to try to accomplish.
Qu'est-ce qu'il pense de Macron et qui pourrait être le Trump à la française?
What do you think of Macron? And who do you think could be the Trump in France, the French Trump?
Well, I think
The
that
closest.
I think that Macron is a globalist. You know, to me, he's when people say he's a nationalist, I say, yeah, he's a nationalist, but the capital of his nation is not Paris, it's Brussels, right? He sees himself as a European, right? And and everything, all of his policies, everything he was driving towards, and the whole argument he made about the European project of further integration. Remember, in September of 2017, he articulated the logical conclusion of the project, which is more commercial integration, capital markets integration, budgetary integration, eventually foreign policy and military integration. It was essentially to create a United States of Europe where they would run it out of Brussels and Davos, right? And so that he's laid out his cards. And I think one of the things that Gilets Jaunes, the revolt against his policies and his attitude, is what forced him to go to these town halls in rural France. Remember, he canceled going to Davos this year. He didn't want to do that. That must have crushed him, right? Because that's his natural environment. He was forced to go to these town halls and kind of make amends and to try to go on a listening tour to listen to people's thing. Listen, I still said it, and I said it before, is that everything Marine Le Pen, you go back and look at the debates. You go back and look at the campaign. Okay? Everything she said that Macron was going to do, Macron has done. All of his policies and globalist in nature, she basically said, if you vote for him, here's what you're going to get. And he's played right into that because she was the one that was able to identify exactly what he is. I happen to think that National Rally, if you look at the polling, where it's come back from, is potentially the best vehicle. And I think that that's why these European parliamentary elections are so important. Those two slates, if this should be looked at by the French people, I think in one regard as a midterm election, right, as a referendum on Macron. And if I think it's properly looked at, and particularly the two alternatives, remember before the power Macron and Merkel had, there was no counter narrative. It was basically more integration, more United States of Europe, or chaos. More integration or anarchy. More integration or no prosperity, right? Because you have nothing but these madmen, these crazy people over there. Now with Orban and Salvini and Le Pen and Alternative for Deutschland and what you're seeing coming out of Poland, you're seeing a counter-narrative. That counter-narrative is that, hey, we're not trying to destroy the European Union. Not one of these people are saying we should get out or we're trying to destroy it. What they're saying is that it has to be reformed. It has to be reformed fundamentally. That the alternative is a Europe of nations, right? A Europe of independent, sovereign nation states. And that counter-narrative is what's now driving, there's just a poll out a couple weeks ago that shows that Salvini, I think, could be the number one party in France, the League. And I think it was the National Rally could be like the third or fourth biggest party if they get as many votes potentially as they could get. So I think the French people should look at this as a midterm election, a referendum on Macron. But I happen to think the best vehicle that France has is the National Rally. And if they pull together what I think they can do with working class people as an alternative, I think they could do very well. Man, if they get 25 to 30%, that'll be an earthquake. That'll be an earthquake in the European Parliament.
Comment est-ce qu'ils voient les élections européennes? Est-ce que ça peut être un tournant historique pour les populistes? Et qu'est-ce qui répond à ceux qui l'accusent d'ingérence dans ces élections?
How do you see European election as a whole? And would you say it could be really a turning point for populist movement? And second, what do you answer to people who say, in getting involved in European election, you interfere, try to influence from abroad the election? What do you answer to them?
Number one, I think that this European parliamentary election is a massive and major inflection point in European history, not just in politics. Because I think now you're seeing the rising voices of Salvini, the rising voices of Kurz in Austria, of Orban in Hungary, of Vox in Spain, which I think is going to surprise people in the elections we have in a couple weeks and Le Pen in the National Rally, just across the board. I think you're seeing this populist nationalist sovereignty movement really get its legs. and it's going to be very competitive and offer people alternative. You know, what I tell people is that the parties in Europe don't need my help. They don't need my assistance. They're fully capable and run great campaigns on their own. All I'm doing is exactly what I was doing for the 10 years before the Trump brought me on board, and I just took out 1 year of my life from August to August of 16 to 17 to work with Trump. Is that I've been working on this populist program for 10 years. I'm going to work on it for another 10 or 20 years as long as I have the energy to do this. And so anywhere that there's a populist movement, and I just got back from Japan and I'm heading back to Asia right after the European parliamentary elections. I've been down in South America with Bolsonaro, right? Anywhere I can help a populist, anywhere I can help this nationalist movement, anywhere I will help it. Because quite frankly, it is a movement that is based upon the nation state, but it is worldwide in its outlook, and it's going to change the history of the world. And one of the big changing points is May 23rd, 24th, and 25th of this year in the spring, when you're going to have, I think, just a tremendous momentum going by these populist nationalist parties.
Ok. Trois petites questions sur Trump. Est-ce qu'il a tenu ses promesses? Quel bilan il fait de la politique de Trump? Est-ce qu'il a tenu ses promesses de campagne? Quels sont ses rapports avec lui aujourd'hui? Et peut-il être réélu?
Three little question on Donald Trump. Would you say he kept his promise? He did what he was supposed to do? Are you still in relation with him? And do you think he could be reelected?
Number one, I think he has kept, and I think he understands the importance of keeping the promises he made, particularly on building the wall, of getting structural changes from China and getting out of these foreign wars in Afghanistan and Syria. If you look at his State of the Union address that was given a couple of weeks ago, the three key, besides all the happy talk about unity, and that was just all happy talk because the Democrats are coming after him, if you look at the three major things he talked about in that speech, he said, I am building a wall, I'm getting structural changes in any deal with China, not just more soybeans, and I'm going to get us out of Afghanistan and Syria. Those are the three central promises he made in the 2016. Now, where it's all a struggle, right? The Republican establishment and the Democrats and the courts, everybody are fighting him on the wall. Now he's gotten some money from the Pentagon. He's called an emergency. That's going to be adjudicated, but he's hammering to do that. The wall clearly won't be finished by the time of his re-election, but at least he's showing the American people he's fighting for it. He's fighting for immigration. We have this massive crisis on the border that in the next couple of weeks you guys are going to see all type of other stuff happen because it's getting worse by the day. On China, he's clearly trying to get this done. And so I think, yes, and he, as you know, he's got a plan in Afghanistan, and they're negotiating with the Taliban, and he's trying to do in Syria. Are all these going to be accomplished? Who knows? But I think that people are going to say, hey, he promised us he'd do it, and he's pushing every day to get it done. I think that people cannot 2020 is all going to be about the next 6 months in this kind of what I call the gauntlet. And the gauntlet is all these investments. By losing the midterm elections in 2018 and empowering the House of Representatives, he's basically allowed the Democrats to have all these investigations over his business, his family, his taxes in the Mueller report. Now, the big wild card is the Mueller report came, and as I said, it didn't have anything in it, so Trump's turned the tables automatically, and he's going to war. He's coming off the chain, and he's going right at the Democrats. The next 6 months is going to be, if you think it's been ugly before, you haven't seen anything. This in the next 6 months is going to get nasty. I mean, in Michigan, at the rally the other night, Trump goes, they should fire all these senior guys in the media, right, the opposition party media. He should, the FBI guys should be looked at for treason, the senior guys that did these investigations, and they should fire Schiff and other Democrats off these committees. That's the President of the United States in a full-out attack mode against his enemies. So I think this thing's very tough. As it looks right now, I think, particularly given the way that the Democrats have kind of stumbled out of the box, I think, a little bit, that if Trump continues on this path, I don't see anybody that's in the field today that can beat him. And I think the best they could do is a combination of a Harris as president, a Beto as VP, to try to galvanize their youth and that kind of millennial vote to try to get some energy to come against him. But even that, I think, doesn't. I think Trump right now if he gets through these next 6 months, and I think he's going to be empowered. So this is going to be, and when people say how close you to Trump, I said, hey, he called himself a nationalist right, a few months ago. We've never been closer because even when I was running the campaign, he never called himself a nationalist. So he is aligned with every policy that he said he was going to do. The last thing I think too is that people in France should understand that he's not looking to destroy NATO. He's not looking. He's been over here a couple of times already. He's got a great affinity for France, great love for this country, as the people in the United States do. We wouldn't be free and independent if we didn't have France as an ally, right, during the revolution. And so there's a great common bond and a lot of affinity between the two nations. And Trump is a huge believer in France and thinks France is one of our top couple of allies.
On a encore 3 minutes ou...
We have 3 more minutes or
Yes,
it's done?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Le mouvement populiste mondial est forcément une lame de fond qui va durer avec un réel retour des nations. Est-ce qu'il y a un risque malgré tout que ce soit une vague passagère?
Would you say the populist movement is really a deep movement who's going to take everything by storm, or do you think it could be just a little wave that goes?
Oh no, I think it's a deep movement. I think it's already taken certain things by storm. It's put the political class in the United States in complete shock. How this could happen, and they didn't know it. When I go around, I just came from Italy, where I was there for 8 days, and I had parties fly in from all over Europe to meet with me. Everywhere you're talking is that the elites are in shock that this thing's going. Bolsonaro came to the United States for 4 days, and I hosted him for the first day they got there. It's a total revolution in Latin America. They're throwing out all the cultural Marxists and all the socialist governments are going to be thrown out in the next 5 years and all replaced by populist nationalist governments. And so this is in Abe, I was in Japan, he's a nationalist, right? That's why he won. He was the first nationalist to get elected. This populist nationalist movement is worldwide in its scope, and it's deep. And the opposition, it's not going to be easy. We're going to have defeats, right? We had one a little bit over the weekend in Slovakia, right? You're not going to win every election. This is a process. It's a process of multiple elections. Look at UK. The kind of the populist part of the UK had a terrible defeat last week with the lack of the Brexit. And we'll have to see what happens. So it's not going to be all wins, but there's a tectonic plate shift that you see worldwide where now people are taking this populist movement. And here's the thing. It's not dependent on just Trump or Salvini or Bolsonaro. Those are charismatic leaders or people like Le Pen that have taken it forward. But underneath, you're now having buy-in by a lot of working class people that say, see, I can see the possibilities of what we can do. Once you deliver more as you govern, Trump governing, Salvini governing, Orban governing, Bolsonaro governing, once you get in and govern and show results, it's only going to pick up momentum. And so it's deep, it's not a little wave.
Il a dirigé Breitbart News. Qu'est-ce qu'il pense que de la révolution numérique? Est-ce qu'elle a accompagné cette révolution conservatrice et nationale? Et est-ce que c'est une menace ou une chance pour la démocratie?
Pour la démocratie?
Ouais.
How do you analyze, you were the head of a media, Breitbart, how do you analyze the change of the situation in politics through the social media, through internet? And could you say it could be a threat to democracy?
Democracy's never been more robust, and this is why, remember, people only said democracy had a problem when the elites started losing elections. Once they started losing elections, democracy's a problem, right? Because they're getting their ass kicked. In the United States this past year, in November of 2018, we had 113 million people vote, okay? The biggest off-year election in history. I happen to think you're going to have more people vote than ever in your European parliamentary elections. People are more engaged, and part of that's social media. Now, politics is becoming part of one's lifestyle. That's why politics today is not about persuasion, it's about mobilization, right? And social media has disintermediated. It's one of the things Breitbart did. Just the mainstream media being able to lecture you every day. You now have alternatives. And I think even there, we're just at the beginning of the game. It's going to increase. Remember, Salvini and Bolsonaro won because of Facebook Live. I'll bet you Salvini didn't spend $5 million on his campaign. It was all Facebook Live. Bolsonaro, to become the president of Brazil, spent $750,000. That's it. Okay? Because of Facebook Live. So you're seeing, and now they keep, and look at Cortez. People forget, a year ago today, Cortez was a bartender, making about $17,000 a year and closing up the night shift at her bar. Today, she's the third most important political figure in back of Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, and herself in the United States, the most powerful nation on earth. She's the third most powerful. And she was a bartender last year at this time. And that's all because of social media. Social media is incredibly powerful, and I think we're just starting to see the beginning of it. I gotta jump.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Photo?
Yeah, it's a few pictures.
Sure. Let me just throw my jacket on so I can get that.
Will you keep your jacket?